So in this video we're going to pick up the thread and think more about contextualism, strong disagreement, and metalinguistic negotiation. I'm going to first pick up the question I posed at the end of the last video, which was about what kind of evidence would favour a particular explanation of this disagreement, and does contextualism actually have any positive evidence to think that disagreements about knowledge are really metalinguistic negotiations? As we saw, this is an important question because simply observing that there's more than one kind of disagreement doesn't automatically vindicate the contextualist. It doesn't automatically mean, in the case that we're interested in, disagreements are of the right kind. So we should ask, well, what would be evidence that debates over knowledge really are metalinguistic negotiations rather than what we might call factual disagreements over propositions? The reason why we're only going to talk about this briefly is because this is an area where the debate has taken a kind of experimental turn. So as we'll talk about again at the end, arguments about disagreement have cropped up in lots of different areas. So the argument about disagreement is not just a problem for contextualism about knowledge. Similar arguments are problems for contextualism about personal taste, about ought and should claims, about epistemic modal claims, like about what might be the case and what must be the case. Similar problems arise for contextualism in all these domains. And this is why there's been a lot of interest in particular about what it takes for people to disagree. Now what's happened is that people have gone and done experiments basically asking people what their judgments are about various cases. So for instance, they'll give people a case where two people are disagreeing about something, like a predicate of personal taste, like disagreeing about whether something is tasty, or they give them a case where they're disagreeing about whether it might be raining or something like that. And what we find is the pattern of judgments is sort of more interesting than you might expect. And it's certainly a bit more interesting than the relativists might expect, because there tends to be variation in how acceptable people find these things. So for instance, even if somebody says something is tasty which you don't like, what you'll find is that ordinary people, when you ask them, are more sympathetic than disagreement arguments would suggest to the claim that the person who said, for instance, licorice is tasty, is saying something true, even if those people themselves don't like licorice. One thing that people have started doing as well is just straightforwardly asking people in cases of disagreement, are the claims that the disagreeing people are making, are they incompatible with each other? So if we have a case where somebody says something is tasty and somebody disagrees, are they saying things that are incompatible? That's the question asked. That's the wording that's being used. And in a variety of other cases, so cases like predicates of personal taste, or even some cases involving should claims or ought claims, claims about something like morality, there's some evidence that ordinary people regard the disputants as saying things that are actually compatible with each other, even though they agree that there's some sort of disagreement going on. Now, it's important to notice that the studies that have been done so far do not pertain to the subject matter we're thinking about today, which is knowledge. So, to my knowledge, there haven't been extensive experimental philosophy done on people's intuitions in general about what's going on in disagreement cases. But this is at least a little bit of good news for the contextualist, in that in a variety of other cases where contextualism seems to be endangered by arguments from disagreement, there are some results that seem to show that when you ask people, are the two parties expressing incompatible propositions, or are they saying incompatible things, there's some inclination for even ordinary people to say no, the things they're saying are completely compatible. Just to reiterate one more time, this does not necessarily get the contextualist about knowledge off the hook, because we haven't directly given evidence about the studies from knowledge, but it should give them some hope that maybe the results will go the same way. I mention this only quickly to kind of put it aside, because obviously this is not something we can really scrutinize further ourselves. Though, if you're interested in this topic, the experimental literature is certainly something worth looking at. What I propose to do instead then is actually to look at a related challenge. Because when we talk about what metalinguistic negotiations were, we've said some sort of, more or less hand-wavy things about what might be going on in the Secretariat case and the Tall case. But we haven't really spelled out exactly what's going on in these cases of disagreement. And this is itself an important challenge for contextualism. If contextualists cannot spell out what a metalinguistic negotiation would be in the first place, if they can't give us a coherent picture of what a metalinguistic disagreement is, and why we should think it's a kind of disagreement, then that would be a problem for the view. That would be a reason to be maybe skeptical that there really is this additional category of metalinguistic negotiation. So what we're going to do for the rest of the video is we're going to think a little bit more about metalinguistic negotiation and think about how exactly we should think about what's going on in such cases. So to give a theory about what's going on with metalinguistic negotiation and how these kinds of disagreements relate to ordinary factual disagreements, we're going to introduce some new ideas that actually we're going to be talking about a lot in the second part of the course that we're moving into from next week. So the idea that's going to be central is this idea of the common ground. So we've thought about a lot about context of utterance. We've said in context of utterance there'll be a speaker, there'll be an audience, there'll be a time, there'll be a lot of other things involved in the context of utterance. But one really important thing that there is in a context of utterance that we haven't talked about so much is this idea of what we call the common ground. And the common ground basically is just whatever information is shared and all parties in the conversation take for granted. So for instance, if we're having a conversation and I say it's raining and you come to believe me, then from that point onwards, the proposition that it's raining comes to be part of the common ground. Because that information is not only something that we both believe, but it's something we'll take for granted in our communicating with each other. So the more general idea of the common ground is just this idea of the information that we take for granted. And as we go along, we're going to spell this out in a more and more rigorous way. But for now, we can just sort of make a list of things that go in the common ground that will extend as we go along. So one thing we might think about as being in the common ground is just a set of worlds. Because remember we said that from the very beginning, we can use sets of possible worlds to just describe states of information. So we can use a set of worlds to describe somebody's belief state, to basically as a picture of all the things they believe. Here we can do a similar thing. We can use a set of worlds to describe all of the factual information about the world all of the parties in the conversation are willing to take for granted. So for instance, if I say it's raining and you come to accept it and we're the only people around, this set of worlds, which as we'll see it gets called the context set, they are only going to be worlds where it's raining from that point onwards. So one part of the common ground is this set of worlds which represents the information that we're willing to presuppose in talking to each other. But you could think that other things go in the common ground as well, because we don't just take for granted factual information, but you might think we also take for granted the ways in which we're using particular words. So for instance, in the case of tall, it might be part of the common ground that we're agreeing to use the word tall in a certain way, that we're agreeing to use it to talk about people that are tall by the standards of an ordinary adult, or we're using it to talk about people who are tall relative to the standards of a basketball player. That is itself a different kind of information that might be part of the common ground, just what the standards are. So that's another thing that we'll take to be part of the common ground, what the standards are. And if you're a contextualist about knowledge, at this point it becomes obvious to think that, well, maybe standards for knowledge are another feature of the common ground. Maybe another kind of thing that goes in the common ground, where the common ground is this information that we take for granted when we're talking to each other. Another thing that might go in there is just the standards for knowledge. So if we're in a low standards context and we all agree, or at least tacitly, that that's the way we're talking, then we might want to represent this by thinking that low standards for knowledge are part of our common ground in this situation. So we're going to think of the common ground as at least involving two things. It has this set of worlds, which represents the sort of factual information about the world that we're holding fixed. And there's also this standard, which is basically the standard for knowledge. You know, what worlds are relevant for whether knowledge claims are true or not. So that's the common ground, the idea of the information we take for granted, and two particular kinds of information that might go into the common ground, the factual information and the information about the standards. As we'll see in more detail, when you start thinking about assertion and what assertions do, one natural thing to say is that at the very least, one thing that assertion does is it changes the common ground. So we already saw an example of that with the assertion of it's raining. So if I say it's raining and you accept that, one thing that does is it changes the common ground. Because before I said it, it may not have generally been accepted. Maybe I knew it, but you didn't. So it wouldn't have been generally accepted that it's raining. But once I say it and you accept it, then of course this becomes common ground. So we see in the ordinary factual case, one role for assertions, one important role for assertions is to change the common ground. But you might think, given that we've isolated these different parts of the common ground, we've said the factual information and the standards, you might think, well, maybe assertions don't always just change the factual common ground, maybe they can also change the standards. So maybe something that we can do with assertions, and maybe something we can do even when we actually don't add any factual information, is that we can try to change the standards. So maybe that's in particular something that's going on in cases of disagreement. Maybe Billy the skeptic, what he's trying to do when he's disagreeing with Alice the non-skeptic is change the standards in the common ground, change them from being low standards to high standards, in something of a similar way to when I make a factual assertion, I change the factual common ground from a set of worlds which leaves open whether it's raining to one that entails that it's raining. And once we allow that assertions can do either of these things, or that they can change the common ground in either of these ways, it actually starts to become kind of easy to see what disagreement in general amounts to and how it happens in the different cases. So you might just think on this model, a disagreement happens whenever one person is trying to change the common ground in one way and their audience wants to reject that change. So if I'm trying to change, if I'm, by making an assertion, trying to make some change to the common ground, either to the factual part or to the standards part, and you don't want that change, you either don't want it to become common, you either don't want some information to become common ground, or you don't accept the way that I'm trying to change the standards, you might think either of those qualifies disagreement, because we're not coordinating on how the common ground should be. And then once you've said that, it becomes really obvious how there can be these two different kinds of disagreement. We get factual disagreement of the kind that the strong disagreement principle talks about, when we're disagreeing about how to change the factual common ground, when I want to add some information to the set of worlds and you don't want me to add it, you reject my proposal to add that information. But we get these metalinguistic disputes when I'm trying to change the standards and you want to reject the way that I'm changing the standards. So once you introduce this idea of the common ground and the different parts of the common ground, distinguishing maybe the factual information from the standards about how we use words, we actually see there's a very nice picture that contextualists can use, draw upon, to give an explanation of what's going on in these knowledge cases. What's going on when Alice the non-skeptic disagrees with Billy the skeptic, even if they agree on all the facts about whether Alice knows by low standards and knows by high standards. What's going on is they're disagreeing about what standard should be in the common ground in their conversation. Alice wants it to be the low standards, Billy wants it to be the high standards. Remember, we said it would be a problem for contextualism if they couldn't spell out in a convincing way what metalinguistic negotiation was and why we should think of it as a kind of disagreement. But once we introduce this idea of the common ground and the different parts of the common ground, we actually see there is a very nice story the contextualists can tell. As I say, we're going to be saying a lot more about the common ground in weeks to come, but this is hopefully enough to let you see that there is a kind of workable story here for the contextualist to tell. So we've done a lot to resuscitate contextualism in this video. So when we started talking about the argument from disagreement, initially I think things seemed pretty bad for contextualism on this score. Relativism might have seemed like an obviously superior view. The aim of this lecture was to turn things on their head a little bit. However, I don't want to leave you with the impression that all is necessarily settled in favour of the contextualists either. On the one hand, we saw there is this issue about what positive evidence there actually is for thinking debates between skeptics and non-skeptics are these metalinguistic negotiations. There's maybe some reason for the contextualists to be hopeful based on other cases, but that's pretty weak evidence, so they certainly should not sleep easy on that score just yet. But the other thing we can notice, even without doing any experimental philosophy, is that we've talked about a lot of things this semester, about a lot of problems for contextualism and views like it. And disagreement was sort of one version of a broader problem. Because we've been thinking all along about what happens when people with one set of standards, or who are supposed to have one set of standards, start thinking about the claims of people with other standards. Disagreement is a particularly pointed way to think about it because they're actually talking to each other and they're actually disagreeing with each other. And we've now seen something in account of how that might work, how that might be intelligible on the contextualist view. But remember, we've also thought about plenty of other cases where people with different standards, they're not like talking to each other, they're sort of overhear what each other say. So the very first time we talked about contextualism, we talked about the case where the skeptic overhears somebody in the hall say something like, "I know my car is parked outside." And we asked the question, well, what should the skeptic think about that claim? And there's a very natural thought that if you're really a thoroughgoing skeptic and you hear somebody else, whether or not you're talking to them, making claims to knowledge of ordinary propositions, you'll think, no, that's not true. You'll want to somehow reject it. And you'll do this regardless of whether you're talking to them or not. It doesn't matter whether you're actually in a conversation with them or not. There seems to be an inclination for skeptics to say, no, that's false, when they hear ordinary people make ordinary knowledge claims. One thing to notice is that, firstly, this seems like a pretty similar issue to the issue with disagreement that we talked about. So, disagreement is a case where people with different standards are actually talking to each other. But these eavesdropper cases where one person in one context is sort of evaluating what was said in another context seems like a similar phenomenon, partly because not only is there this difference in standards, but there's also this inclination to reject what was said by the other person with different standards, regardless of whether you're actually in a conversation with them or not. So there's some reason to think that maybe these issues should be treated together. But it's not 100% obvious that the contextualist explanation of disagreement in terms of metalinguistic negotiation is going to carry over to the kind of eavesdropper cases we talked about from the beginning. So we're thinking again about maybe I'm the skeptic overhearing somebody in the next room making a claim of ordinary knowledge, and I think, no, that's false, or I've some inclination to want to reject it. We should ask, how is that explanation supposed to go for the contextualist? Now, it's certainly not that we're trying to change our common ground in some way, because we're not having a conversation. If I'm hearing somebody making that assertion in the next room, then it's not straightforwardly obvious that we should think that my inclination to reject what they've said is wanting to change the common ground between us. Because, as I said, we're not having a conversation. It doesn't look like in this situation, my assertions are attempts to change whatever is common ground between me and the person outside. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible to extend the explanation we saw of metalinguistic cases to this case. But it does need to be noted that these kinds of eavesdropper cases belong in the same basket with disagreement because they're very similar phenomenon. Both disagreement and eavesdroppers involve cross-contextual or cross-standards evaluation. Whether or not the contextualist explanation of disagreement can be extended to this kind of eavesdropper cases is something that is not 100% obvious. And it's something that's worth thinking about, whether this explanation can be extended when you're thinking for yourself whether contextualism really overcomes the objection from lost disagreement.